Danke. Dann möchte ich jetzt Thomas Schmidt bitten, Mary McAleese vorzustellen.
Yeah, thank you, Doris Reisinger. I mean, it's a common practice at conferences to express feelings of pleasure and honor if you have the privilege to introduce a very distinguished guest. For my life, this sentence has never been so true as in this very moment. So for me, as the recent chair of the Department of Catholic Theology, it is an honor and a great privilege to welcome Dr. McAleese to our conference. And it's wonderful that you participate and that you find the time to bear with us. Now, introducing you to such a crowd is a little bit like carrying coals to Newcastle, and it's also futile to trying to capture all your achievements. But let me please highlight a couple of things, since there might be people listening outside who might not so familiar with all your work, especially in our context in criticizing from a, let's say, loyal point of view, the Catholic Church and recent developments from within. Dr. McAleese, of course, has been served for 14 years as the 8th President of the Republic of Ireland from November 1997 to 2011. And she was the first individual born in Northern Ireland to become President of the Republic of Ireland. And that's no surprise then that she described the theme, the topic of her presidency as building bridges. This building was materialized in many attempts of consolation, for example, foster the dialogue with the Unionist community, the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. And as president, Dr. McAleese accomplished to invite Queen Elizabeth to Ireland, which was the first visit of a British monarch to the Republic of Ireland after independence. But let me focus on some of the academic achievements. Already since the mid-70s, Dr. McAleese was professor of criminal law at the beginning at the Trinity College in Dublin. During the 70s, she already started a campaign as legal advisor and founding member of the campaign for homosexual law reform. After her presidency, she, it seems to me, developed a growing interest in canon law, above all, in a way motivated by all the recent occurrences in the Catholic Church, the sexual abuse, but also the discrimination of women. And this growing interest in canon law earned her a degree in canon law in 2018 from Rome's Pontifical Gregorian University. And in October 2018, Dr. McAleese was appointed Professor of Children, Law and Religion at the University of Glasgow. And I think your topic will be settled in this, situated in this realm. She is a practicing Roman Catholic and holds liberal views, as many of you know, about homosexuality, the role of women and priests, and let's see, modern recent conception of family. Let me just highlight three attitudes of her in a more anecdotal way to express how she thinks about those topics and how her humor and her spirit is. When she visited or saw the Synod of Bishops of Family in October 2015, Dr. McAleese ridiculed the concept of 300 elderly celibates coming together to discuss family questions. To quote her, "If I wanted expertise on the family, I honestly cannot say that the first thing that would come into my mind would be to call together 300 celibate males who, as far as we know, have never raised a child." But she also is a more fierce critic, for example, of the structural discrimination of women in the Catholic Church. She has branded the Catholic Church as an empire of misogyny. The leadership of the Catholic Church has never sought a cure for this virus, although the cure is freely available. Its name is equality. And about the ordination of women, Dr. McAleese once quoted, "I believe that women should be ordained. I believe the theology on which the exclusion is based is pure codology. I'm not even going to be bothered arguing it. Sooner or later, it'll fall apart." I think the achievements and accomplishments of her are nicely wrapped up in the eulogy which has been offered as a justification for the Alphonse Auer Award. In last summer, August 29th, Dr. McAleese was announced as the winner of the Alfons Auer Ethics Award at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And she received this award for her political dedication in building bridges across divisions in society, especially in the conflict in Northern Ireland, for her commitment to reform the Catholic Church after the sexual abuse scandals, for her theological and ethical advocacy for the rights of children, for the complete equality of women in church ministries, and for the acceptance of sexual diversity. I think this dedication, her dedication to build bridges across the divisions in society while firmly criticizing those divisions and exclusions, is of utmost importance for our conference, which tries to exercise Machtkritik durch Theologie, that is, trying to criticize ecclesiastical power by the very means of theology. Dr. McAleese, we are very happy to have you among us, and we're looking forward to your talk about the flaws in the Christening Contract. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I apologize that I cannot speak in German, so I also hope that my English will be intelligible enough for this audience. And thank you, Doris, for the chance to be part of today. I'm really about the business of trying to generate an internal debate in the Catholic Church about the place, the role, the impact of human rights on canon law. It's a debate that is overdue, and I believe it really starts with our children, and that's the appropriate place to start. So what I'm going to look at is the flaws in the Christening Contract, by which I mean that covenant or contract that we enter into at baptism and by baptism. And the way in which, wrapped into that contract, are two separate strands. One essentially theological and spiritual, one gift, gratuitous gift from God, the other juridic, man-made, legal, canon law, obligation, duty. So that's the space that I'm going to talk in today. The first thing is, no one is born Catholic. Despite any of you who have seen the film, Mary, Queen of Scots, the opening line says, "Mary, Queen of Scots, was born a Catholic." It ruined the film for me from the beginning. and also for my family, because I insisted on saying, that is theologically incorrect, that is canonically incorrect. And my family said, shut up, we want to watch the film. But it is a commonly held notion that somehow we are born Catholic. No. We become members of the Catholic Church by baptism. And infant baptism is normative in the Catholic Church. More than that, it is mandated by the canon law of the Catholic Church for the children of all Catholic parents. As a result, 85% of all the Catholics in the world today, and we are 1.2 billion people, 85% of us became members of the Catholic Church when we were baptized as infants. On that day, when we were too young to know what was happening, and indeed our parents hoped fervently that we would stay asleep through the entire process, we were entered by others into a christening contract or a covenant, and one with profound lifelong effects. And I should say at the outset, I am not an opponent of infant baptism. I want to discuss how we can disaggregate the theological effects of baptism, which are very beautiful and gratuitous, from the canon law effects, which are not so beautiful, to put it mildly. So some of these effects, baptism is a very complex sacrament. Some of the effects of baptism are, as I say, gratuitous gifts from God, which are let me call them spiritual or theological, while others are these man-made, juridic, legal consequences. And so it is the legal consequences that I am anxious to extract and bring into a debate about how problematic they remain today, and they are increasingly, in the light of our understanding of human rights. The theological, the beautiful ones are the obvious ones. The child is freed from original sin, so the gateway to salvation and the other sacraments opens. Born again as a child of God, made like to Christ by an indelible character, that's the ontological consequence or effect, and incorporated into the Christi Fideles. And these are all ways in which there is a transfer, the possibility of a transfer of grace from God to the child and the growing child right through life. The juridic or canon law consequences include becoming enrolled as a lifelong member of the Latin Catholic Church, and as a member, then becoming subject to the rules and laws of membership. And there are many such laws. And by baptism, we are presumed then to have entered into a covenant or a contract by which we undertake the obligations of membership. Members do have certain rights that are set out in canon law in the 1983 code, but the rights that we talk about in the secular world, rights that you will find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, or more importantly today, for this purpose, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child of 1989. Those rights include freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, including the freedom to change one's religion. Now, these are thought to derive, or it is argued they derive from the natural law, which we Catholics would call divine law. In other words, these arise innately by virtue of the individual human dignity, of the God-given human dignity of the person. But those rights, the right to freedom of religion, conscience, thought, belief, and freedom to change religion, within Catholic Church canon law, these are not recognized in canon law. Instead, they are subordinated to the demands of compulsory obedience to the magisterium of the Church, in other words, to the doctrines and teachings which come from the Church's extensive magisterium, and the obligation to maintain communion, communio with the Church. The consequence of that is that from baptism onwards, through childhood, through adolescence, the going to Catholic schools, the being raised in a Catholic home, the catechesis that child members of the Church receive from the beginning is based on the presumption that to profess the faith. This is not a catechesis of invitation, as we would expect, for example, if you were dealing with a catechumen who was an unbaptized person. It's not a catechesis of invitation, it is a catechesis of obligation. It's quite the opposite, in fact. It says to the child, you must do this, you must believe this, you must accept that. Because by baptism, that is what you undertook to do. So from baptism onwards, the Church will never offer to the child, particularly as the child grows and matures and is able to balance and able to make up its own mind, and it will certainly never offer it either in adolescence or in adulthood. It will never offer its members a formal opportunity when sentient and capable of mature decision-making to accept or reject the obligations of baptism that were set out in canon law and church doctrine and teaching. I believe that the idea the fundamental, foundational notion that those who are baptized as infants, the paedo-baptized as we call them, the idea that they are capable of making binding baptismal promises and taking on lifelong obligations, particularly those which compromise their freedom of thought and belief, that is a fiction. It is a figment whose illusory nature the church can no longer escape dealing with. Individual human rights and our growing understanding of those and the development of them, they have pulled back the curtain that has obscured the reality of that fiction. There was a time when the debate that I'm suggesting that we need to happen, and indeed the time has not entirely passed, when the debate was simply shrugged off as irrelevant. The church has taught that the reconciliation of canon law with secular human rights law is unnecessary. Why? Because the church is a perfect society. It has its own means, the means required for its own end, the salvation of mankind, and it is supreme in its own domain. In other words, the sphere of the secular world could never hope to encroach on the sovereign sphere of the church. But nowadays, in our contemporary world, a number of very important developments have interrupted that view. The most important of which is that in 1990, the Holy See voluntarily ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. When it did that, it became a state party to the convention. And all state parties, including the Holy See, voluntarily undertook the obligations of the convention. Article 4 says that all state parties agree to undertake all appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures for the implementation of the rights recognized in the convention. Now, among those rights in the convention, recognized by the Holy See as innate human rights, are the rights of the child set out in Article 14 and the rights of parents. It says, state parties shall respect the right of the child to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And they shall respect the rights and duties of parents to provide direction to the child in the exercise of his or her rights in a manner consistent with the evolving capacities of the child. Now, this is a hugely different model from the model that the church traditionally has operated out of, where the parents the Catholic parents make the decision, bind the child at baptism for life to lifelong membership. That model has now been replaced by the convention saying, yes, parents can baptize their children. Yes, they can raise them in the faith, but they cannot impose lifelong membership of that faith on any other human being. They cannot impose that on a child. And a child here means anyone under the age of 18. That's in other words, what we call a minor in canon law. So the impact of the article is to recognize the rights of parents, as I say, and I have no problem at all with parents baptizing their child, raising the child in the faith, but it does not confer a right to bind a child to that faith for life, or forever fetter their discretion to change their faith, to think for themselves, to evaluate the magisterium's doctrines and teachings, to change its beliefs, to contradict its church. Rather, it interprets parental rights in a very, very, if you like, a new and radical way, which says that those parental rights must always be used as instruments to help the child as its capacities evolve to exercise its freedom of religion, its freedom of thought, its freedom of belief. And obviously, the information that a child has access to, how it evaluates that information, how it arrives at its beliefs and thoughts, will be dictated to a large extent by the way in which and the content of the information that is supplied to it and that is available to it. Back in 2007, the International Theological Commission, which advises the Pope, as you know, acknowledged in its words, there is a lack of free will and responsible choice on the part of infants. They therefore cannot decide for themselves. Yet it failed to follow through on the logic of that and did not raise any question about the legitimacy then of imposing serious lifelong baptismal duties and obligations on children who cannot decide for themselves. Similarly, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, avoided the logic of its own insistence, in its own words, no one can be forced to embrace the Catholic faith. It, of course, nuanced the declaration by saying that it applies only to the non-baptized, since those who are baptized are deemed by baptism to have already embraced the faith and to be under, therefore, an obligation to profess it. So once again, the baptized child who becomes the adult loses out. There is no space in their lives to decide for themselves. So there's a considerable disconnect here between what the Church says to the outside world and what it says internally, and a disconnect between what it says to the Convention on the rights, or about the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a state party, about a child's freedom of religion, thought, conscience, and belief, and then what canon law provides in the restrictions that it imposes on those freedoms, and we have yet to reconcile those two disconnects. In its dialogue, the Holy See has been in dialogue since 1990 with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. Under the Convention, there is a provision for regular monitoring of the progress made by a state party in the honouring of its obligations to implement the rights of the child. So every so often, state parties, of which there are over 190, it is the single most ratified treaty in the history of UN treaties. Only one country has not ratified, and that is the United States. All the rest have. So the Holy See ratifies it, and because it does, it enters into a dialogical process with the committee, and it has gone through two courses of dialogue with the committee. And the Holy See acknowledges that when it ratified the convention, it did so on behalf of two quite distinct entities. One is the Holy See, as we know it, which governs the entire Catholic Church and is responsible for its laws. The other is a very small entity, and that is the Vatican City-State, in which the Holy See's headquarters essentially are situated. Now, regrettably, after 20 years of discussion and really out of the blue, the Holy See suddenly changed its argument, the nature of its discussion with the committee, and began to argue that, and this of course regrettably happened after the Committee on the Rights of the Child raised the issues of the clerical abuse scandals for the first time. It didn't raise those scandals in the first round of discussion, but it did in the second. And at the end of that second round of discussions, you can see a step change, a sea change actually, in the arguments made by the Holy See. Suddenly, it raises a very important, what I might call a fundamental jurisdictional point. It says that the Holy See, as the governing authority of the entire Catholic Church, is not under a treaty obligation to implement the convention in its laws, in other words, in canon law. that it is only under an obligation to implement the rights set out in the Vatican City States law. And it argues that on the basis that the only territory it holds is the Vatican City State, and that there is no other territory in which to implement. Now, it is true, of course, the Vatican cannot implement laws for Ireland or for England, but it does have a very extensive and influential set of laws that have universal effect. Personally, I describe that position that they have taken as ludicrous and untenable. It's embarrassingly bad. And of course, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has contradicted it completely out of hand and said, no, go back, read the text that you signed in 1990 when you became a state party. You entered into exactly the same contract, the same set of obligations as every other state party. So you must implement the convention and its rights within canon law. So it has asked the church to do that. Now, historically, the church has always wound together the two sets of baptismal effects, the theological and the juridic, and it has bound them so tightly together that it has argued against the idea of disaggregating them, of separating them. I believe today it is absolutely essential that they are separate. It is important that the church reconsider the legal foundations of the juridic effects with their duties and obligations, and that it would do that over and against contemporary understanding of fundamental human freedoms. And these are freedoms which the church itself claims to recognize, often discusses in the great global sphere from that pulpit of the world. It has also itself undertaken, given a solemn undertaking to the Convention and to the United Nations to implement those rights within its own structures. And I believe that if the church is to have a future built on solid rock and not sinking sand, then these basic fundamental flaws, which are becoming more and more apparent in the Christening Contract, must be faced up to. Why? In the Western world, we know that many people are walking away from the church. Why? Because they're perfectly entitled to. Even if the church says they can't or they shouldn't or they could be penalized, they are saying, we are entitled. Our human rights say we can change religion, we can have no religion, we can walk away. So many more of the baptized are simply exercising the right that canon law denies them, but the right that human rights bequeaths them, the rights that are God-given to walk away. Or many more within the church are challenging magisterial teaching because they believe they have a human right, a God-given right to freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief, and that these both enable and empower and impose on them an obligation to debate that which they believe to be incorrect in the church, to be badly structured, to have a structural basis that requires challenge. So that many people nowadays, even within the church, believe that our right to freedom of conscience trumps canon law's insistence on passive obedience to the magisterium and the demands of communio. And that's a reality we are facing, particularly in the West. I take the point that that if you look at the growth, the numbers, the church is growing in Africa, it is growing in Asia. Yes, that is true. But just because it is flying new planes does not mean that those planes are fit for purpose. They all carry with them the fundamental flaw in the structure, which eventually, as in the West, will catch up and will have to be faced. The stressing of the structure is such, we in the West can perceive the cracks. We're experiencing them. We're living with the fractures. They will eventually catch up everywhere else. And I believe that the outworking of this single issue has been long overlooked, precisely because it could shake the very foundations of the edifice on which the church rests. It has profound implications for all church members, not just children, but for adults. And yet I also believe that if it is addressed, it'll be like, and if it is addressed well, and if it is addressed intelligently and with generosity, it holds out the prospect of, instead of holding the church like the grains of sand tightly in one's fist and watching the grains drip through, that we hold the church and the grains of sand in the palm of our hands, gently, where they stay. They don't drift away. 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis seemed to me to come very, very close to hitting this nail on the head in a message that he gave to the Pontifical Mission Societies on the Feast of the Ascension. He said, for each one of us, salvation can take place only through the lens of an encounter with the one who calls us. It is useless and above all improper, he says, to insist on presenting missionary activity and the proclamation of the gospel as if they were a binding duty, a kind of contractual obligation on the part of the baptized. Now, these are the words of Pope Francis. Yet, it is precisely that which canon law does. What the Pope says is wrong is what canon law says is right. What the Pope says about the need for that faith is a personal encounter. It's a decision to be attracted by God, by Christ. That is not what canon law asks of us, regrettably. Because in failing to do that, in failing to insist on the right of each of us to that personal encounter and to accept it or reject it, in insisting that we only use the law and say to people, you are obliged to believe, you must profess, you've been baptized, you're obliged to become a witness to the gospel. In using that language, I think nowadays, we insult the intelligence of the human person. And so it is unfortunately the case that what canon law does for the execution of the salvific mission of the church overwhelmingly depends on the mandatory enrollment of infants as full church members and this automatic imposition on them of duties, of obligations. As a model, it is no longer working in the West. Why? Because we now begin to understand how fundamentally flawed it is. And in a world where individual human rights are now our language, our element, we see its flaws. It won't work for the future. In the recent past, we've had 2 synods devoted to the family and 1 devoted entirely to youth. Remarkably, every one of them abysmally failed to deal with the human rights of child members of the church. The Convention on the Rights of the Child did not even get mentioned. It is quite extraordinary. When the more recent Commission on the Protection of Minors, for the protection of minors, was set up by the Pope, I examined all of its website, its documents, for mention of the convention. And eventually, in frustration, I wrote to them and said, you don't mention the convention. Now they do, but only in response to being reminded that they did not. And it seems to me what we have is a church management which in its formation is not fluent, not educated in today's understanding and the developing understanding of human rights generally and the human rights of the child, and how that will impact on the home, the family, catechesis, school, all of which in the Catholic context operate out of a model of a catechesis of obligation based on baptism. It has to change. Thank you.